The Japanese military expansion of the 1930s into China proper created an artificial shortage of resources, the wholesale exodus of population, and a lowering of the standard of living of the general public. Many of the young soldiers mobilized into the Japanese army by the early 30s came from the countryside, where the effects of the Great Depression were devastating and poverty was widespread. Their commitment to the military effort to expand Japanese territory to achieve economic security is understandable. On one hand, the Army had its focus on China and expanding its reach there. Even though originally the idea of Korean and Chinese expansion was to support the well-being of the resource-poor country of Japan, those expeditions actually created shortages and a lowered standard of living in the homeland. After the fall of France in 1940, Japan invaded French Indochina, far to the south. In Japan in the 1930s and 40s, the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army had differing goals and strategic opinions. The Army would sometimes begrudgingly support the Navy, but they did not always agree on what should be done. This created a two-headed monster with Prime Minister Tojo and the Emperor in charge. The Japanese military faced a problem in that certain critical raw materials, especially oil and rubber, were not available within the Japanese sphere of influence. Instead, Japan received most of its oil from the United States and rubber from British Malaya, the very two Western nations trying to restrict Japan's expansion. U.S. President Roosevelt's embargo of oil exports to Japan pressured the Japanese Navy, which had stocks for only about 6 months of operations. The Japanese were in a bind. Strangely, the Japanese needed more resources for the war in China, but the United States and Great Britain were opposing any exports of metal, rubber, and most importantly oil, unless the Japanese stopped their aggression in China. There was also a time limit. The Japanese Navy had only a 6-month reserve supply of oil. If the United States kept up the embargo, then their Navy would be useless and their Army curtailed. Something had to be done, and soon.
Hey Bonnet, what is this? Just wait, something cool's gonna happen.
I think it's starting to like us.
Yeah. Money. Doesn't get any better than this, Beavis. Yep.
The Japanese had already learned to take advantage of European conflicts, like invading French Indochina when France fell in 1940. Why not seize the oil and rubber? The only problem is that the U.S. may declare war on them. Therefore, they decided to strike at the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor, and in lightning strikes invade all the Asian lands that they desired. The Japanese also knew that in a war with the United States, then Australia would likely be a supply dump and an invasion jumping off point for the Allies. So, they decided to invade the southeastern islands like Guadalcanal and Solomons to establish air bases there to disrupt or stop Allied shipping to Australia. In 1942, some of the Japanese leadership believed that the Americans would see the handwriting on the wall and sue for a negotiated peace. After some time passed and the United States geared up for war, the Japanese knew that their industrial output couldn't match the United States. Knowing that resting in a defensive posture was an incorrect long-term strategic goal, the Japanese leadership decided that they needed to switch gears and use the Japanese Navy in an offensive way to have a naval battle of annihilation against the Americans to ensure that they saw the futility of the war. However, the battles of the Coral Sea and Midway in May-June 1942 left Japan with a navy that could never again reach an offensive combination for the rest of the war. Whereas the United States simply replaced its losses and increased its ships, the Japanese couldn't keep up with the status quo of standing naval forces and gradually declined in battle after naval battle. It was only a matter of time that the United States would get the upper hand and stop reacting to Japanese maneuvers and create some moves on their own. Japanese strategies reflected this. They spoke of defensive operations and offensives were dropped. Up until Midway, Japanese military leaders asserted their naval domination in their quest for more resources, but in the end, they lost to the Allies who had more industrial output. If you liked what you see, hit the subscribe button or share. Thank you. This has been EmersusTech.